Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'd like today to talk about uh, some research that I've been doing for the past few years around a project called Palestine Open Maps and the implications of this project on open data. My presentation is titled Open Data Memory and Erasure. First, I'd like to talk about the I would like to make two quotes that uh, have really framed the what I'm talking about on this in this session. Um, the first one is by Salman Abu Sitta, who's basically the godfather of Palestinian maps. He's been collecting maps since like the 1960s, I think, and he talks about how foreigners have been wanting to go to Palestine and map it for a very long time, and they wanted to know the intimate and physical details of and historical characteristics as a prelude to conquering the land. So that's one thing, one quote that I'd like to keep it as a framing for this session. The other quote that I'd like to include is uh, by Antonio Gramsci, and from the prison notebooks, and he talks about that the historical processes have deposited in us an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory, and our task uh, as historians, as geographers, as scholars, is to make an inventory of those tasks, and as people in general. Um, I'd like to think about certain traces that I've seen in my research. And the traces that I want to focus on today are those of Lubia. In those two images, you can see the top image is an image of Lubia today or a few years ago when I went to visit. And the bottom image is that of Lubia the day it was being ethnically cleansed during the Nakba in 1948 in order to create an ethnically Jewish state, majority Jewish state. Uh, the traces that you see in the images, you'll like as you're walking around Lubia, you'll see like a well here, a well there, a few like a wild cactus or a cactus that has grown wild here, and a cactus that has grown wild there, and then what you realize is that path that you're walking on is actually a path, a street or a road that used to exist. And it might actually even be the road that the people of Lubia walked down, uh, or my grandmother, who was from Lubia, walked down as she was being ethnically cleansed. The other thing that you will see is maps of Lubia that are deposited in this open data repository or open knowledge repository that's we call Wikipedia. The maps that you see here are maps made by the British colonial authorities in the 30s and 40s, and some of them even before. But I want to also like zoom in onto these maps and talk about how they got there. They got there from Palestine Open Maps, a project that I've been working on with Visualizing Palestine and my colleague Ahmed Barkley. And here you can see two maps of Lubia, one from 1946, which was 2 years before the Nakba, and you can see the toponym of Lubia in the center with the roads that connect it surrounding it. And on the right, you will see a map published just after the creation of Israel by the Survey of Israel with the exact same features minus the toponym of Lubia. So I want to talk about how these traces of historical data came to us and reached us today. Those maps were made by the British surveyors who came in with the colonial authorities, as I said, as like again going back to the quote of Salman Abu Sitta, and he has been. They like at the beginning it was unimaginable for British surveyors to actually have any non-British surveyors on the survey of Palestine. But eventually, what we saw is that as they started compiling those maps, which you can see a sample of on the right, they didn't have the capacity to produce the entire survey of Palestine. And so they enlisted the help of Palestinian surveyors. So as you can see on the image to the left, there's a school for surveyors that was created by the Survey of Palestine to train Palestinian and Arab surveyors to produce the maps. And you can see in the middle image the training at the school, and to the right are the actual documents of that they produce ultimately at the British Library in London, UK. These maps, after being created, they were distributed all over the world. A lot of copies ended up in different archives. One of them is the National Library of Israel archive, which actually has digitized those maps and put them online. And that's how we access them to create Palestine Open Maps. What we did is that we took each map, cut out the frame, stitched it together, put it online, as you can see in this image. And there were 3 necessary conditions for these maps to actually become accessible to us and be available on Palestine Open Maps, and to have the access that made them eventually land on Wikipedia. One of them is the technical infrastructure. There's a massive set of open source tools that we rely on in the day-to-day of creating those maps and publishing them. It would be impossible for us to create it from scratch. So we rely on open source tools. We also rely on the public domain, and as the original maps that were created by the British surveyors, they are owned by the Crown, and that ownership was expired after 50 years of their publication. So now they are in the public domain, which allows us to reuse them without any restrictions. The third aspect that was necessary was the digitization of these maps by different archival institutions. So we got some of the digitized maps from the Israeli National Archive, but we also got other maps from the David Ramsey map collection. And without these 3 different components, we would never have been able to create Palestine Open Maps. But the question becomes, who is the owner of these maps? Is it the British Crown, actually? Legally, it's the British Crown, even though now the maps are in public domain. But if it was Palestinians who created these maps, as the British survey actually became mostly Palestinian, but the British Survey of Palestine became mostly Palestinian by the end of it, just before the Nakba. Who owns these maps? And to answer kind of this question and to kind of turn it upside down, we decided to kind of indigenize these maps. And the way that we do it is that by disassembling those maps into the individual data points that they contain. And the way I do that is by using open source tools to train hundreds of mappers to redraw basically the entire map using GIS technologies to kind of disassemble the map, and we reassemble it in a way to and publish all of the data under an open data license, which I'll get into in a bit. The open data license is an open data commons attribution license, which allows anyone to take the data and do anything they want with it. And obviously, as Palestinians, we benefit greatly from the existence of this data. We can assert our historical presence. We can produce new forms of knowledge that combine this data with other databases to produce new forms of knowledge. And my colleague Ahmed has created, for example, that has combined this data with the Palestinian Oral History Archive data to create an oral history spatial navigation tool. And what we're also doing is that we're connecting younger Palestinians with the intimate details of the land. As a Palestinian refugee growing up in Palestinian refugee camps in Yarmouk, I went to school in Al Carmel. My grandparents' house was on Lubia Street. All of these places I knew personally by name, but I never knew the physical description of them without except orally through the stories of my grandparents. Now I see how they look like through those maps, and so do all of other Palestinians who have seen these maps as well. But the problem is that this presents a dilemma. As we present the maps and we open the data publicly, this presents a dilemma, which is what about adversarial use? Can there be people who we don't want to be using these maps, using them nevertheless? And this is a problem that's faced by a lot of open data repositories. For example, a lot of Palestinian botanists, when they produce their data, they put it on open data repositories such as iNaturalist. And the iNaturalist data is open and anyone can use it. The problem is that will it be used by the Israeli authorities to control Palestinian access to wild plants in Palestine, as they do? For example, it's like in Israeli law, it's illegal to collect zatar from the mountains, the wild zatar, which is like an essential part of Palestinian diets. It's unimaginable for us to not collect wild zatar, but it's illegal under Israeli law. Will this open data be used against us as Palestinians? So the reactionary response to this question is to act as gatekeepers to this data, and so it becomes a question of like I own the data, and I'm the only person who allows or disallows anyone from using it, with a very kind of authoritarian approach to this data creation and data access. But what I would like to propose is an alternative approach, which is a stewardship approach, which actually has been pioneered by a lot of indigenous organizations and indigenous data groups across the world. And we have models that resemble this in the Arabic-speaking world or in the Islamic world in general. There is the idea of the waqf, which is a trust, basically, a land trust that is governed for the collective benefit of the community for charitable reasons. But it could also be adapted in a way for data. I don't see why it couldn't be. Same concept, which is the musha' or the commons. Can we adapt the commons to be a secular vehicle for data repositories that rely on collective benefit? So the Global Indigenous Data Alliance talks about open data in two different ways. First, they say that, like, yes, data has to be open in the traditional sense, which like they use the acronym, the FAIR acronym, which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So they say, yes, open data should be fair, but they should also follow the CARE principles, which mean that they are targeted towards the collective benefit. They recognize the authority to control the data, and they engender a responsibility for nurturing relationships within communities that the data comes from, and they promote ethical practices to maximize benefits and minimize harms. So this is a framework that I think could be adapted and matched with the WACF framework to promote open data use in our region and around the world. And that's it. I think I've run out of time. Thank you very much.